Hey everyone online. So my name's Nick Hill, also known as Nick Hill. I'm art director and motion designer at Territory Studio. So Territory Studio is a motion graphics studio based in London that specialize in motion graphics for films, games, and brands. So we've worked on movies like Avengers, Age of Ultron, The Martian, Ex Machina, Hitman, Agent 47, all that kind of good stuff. So we do a lot of, basically screen graphics for films. But we also do a bunch of other stuff too. So I'm going to go through a bit about just breaking down the kind of MoGraph workflows that we use in the studio. So as I said, I'm from London. We're based in London. This is Boris Johnson, the ex-mayor of London, but soon to be foreign secretary. We have crazy politicians in England too. This is the team. I'll just blast through quickly because some of you might have seen it. Well, actually, it's a very small portion of the team. So we have David Sheldon-Hicks, creative director, co-founder, Marty Romances, co-founder, Peter Azenyi, head of 3D, creative guru, and Ryan Rafferty-Phelan is a motion designer, Daniel Hoyland, motion designer, and Joy Wilby is a producer. But we also have many other members of the team, but these are the ones I had photographs of, so they made it in. So yeah, I'm going to break down some sort of basic MoGraph workflows using Cinema 4D across a variety of projects. First thing I wanted to do was look at this sort of PolyFX type animation. So when we were working on this title sequence for Red Giant, we did a kind of sort of techie, blocky text animation where basically you animated the text in After Effects, rendered out an image sequence, then pulled that into Cinema 4D and used it as a kind of map on a PolyFX and created this sort of like 3D mosaic effect, as if you were doing like a pixelated effect in After Effects, but you could add sort of secondary animation and dynamics and stuff to it. So what I'll do is I'll show you the finished product, and then I'll kind of go through and break it down layer by layer. So here's the finished title sequence. The basic premise is you have a base animation. So, let's just loop this. So I kind of zazzed it up and added a bit of color and some big bold stuff so people can really kind of understand what's going on. So this is just like an After Effects animation, and essentially you'd render that out and use it as an image sequence and then run it through Cinema and do a bunch of effects on it. So you start with this, and then you run it through the PolyFX sort of animation setup and end up with this. So it basically like turns it all into blocks. And then the setup we made, you have kind of control over the size and the resolution or whatever. And then you can kind of combine them together and create something like that. So you sort of chop it up a bit and have like some secondary animation going on. But it's quite a useful effect for certain things. I've just pushed it a lot harder here so that you can kind of get to grips with what's going on. So if I jump into the Cinema 4D file, initially we made this setup with cubes, but I've simplified it with planes so that you can kind of see what's going on a bit better. So yeah, if we just scrub through here, you can see we've got like a plane inside of a cloner, that's being cloned along the x-axis, and then you drop that inside of another cloner and clone it upwards on the y-axis. And then using a shader effector, we're basically projecting an image sequence onto it. And this, because we have it a bunch of clones of planes, it kind of breaks it down and displaces it and projects it individually, and you get this kind of pixelation effect. So I won't dive too much into the espresso, but basically what we've done is like link the width and the height to the cloner value so that you have control over the resolution of the grid. And so in here, if I just reduce this to like 10, then you can see it's going to be like really blocky and pixelated. But if you increase it to like 50, it probably become quite laggy. Then you begin to get like a few more layers of detail in there, and you could push it really hard and make it really fine. And then the kind of cool thing is, I'll just go back to 25 so that it runs a little smoother, is that, so you have this, and then because it's in a cloner, so it's not just pixelating it, you have like access to other effectors, so you can sort of displace it a little bit. Let's just see what's going on here. So you can, here I've just got a shader that's affecting the position and the scale, and it has like a fall-off gizmo on it. So you can see here it's starting to kind of pull these blocks along. And then that's kind of the premise of like how you get this kind of broken up displacement kind of feel. And you could feed anything into this, like you could feed like a picture of a person and have a really kind of pixelated, glitchy kind of vibe. So it's that kind of idea. And then you can just keep layering up sort of additional effectors and break it up even further, and then just kind of go a bit crazy with it. But if I'll jump into a new scene and quickly sort of show you briefly how it was set up. So initially we did this with cubes, but obviously cubes have 6 sides, so the more you clone it, the more geometry you have, the heavier it gets. So we decided that actually, like, to make it a bit cleaner and easier, if you just use a plane, and then if you wanted to kind of give it 3D depth, you could extrude it. So I'll just lower this down to 1, and like, let's just make this like 10 and 10. Just hit S to zoom right in. Then if you select your plane, hold Alt, and then drop it in a cloner. Your cloner set to linear by default. Let's just make this upright. So we'll just go Z+. Just change the orientation so that when we put a camera in, we're looking like down the Z axis. Sometimes cameras can respond a bit funny if you're looking straight down. So. And then what we want to do is basically just clone this out on the X axis. So we know that if I just switch on lines here, so we know our plane has a width of 10, so we can set that to 10, but also so that everything is driven by our plane. If you right-click and do expressions set driver, and then go to your cloner, and then do right-click expression set driven absolute. So basically, this value will drive the offset of your clone. So now, no matter how much you clone it, they're all going to sort of be butted up against each other, and then you have the opportunity to increase the width and whatever of your plane. So we'll call that cloner X. And then if you drop that cloner inside of another cloner and call it cloner Y, just because it's going up on the Y-axis, then we can do a similar thing. So here we have it cloning on the Y-axis, and what we want to do is basically get the height value, do expression set driver, and then right-click expression set driven, and now it will pop into place. And it's a really simple trick, but now you have this sort of adaptable grid, and so you can kind of play with that, and at any moment sort of have a bit more control over how this whole scene is looking, if you want the lines to be really thin or whatever. So that's the kind of basic premise. We also did some math so that because as it clones out this way, it means that your camera's not going to stay centralized, but what we did was made sure that it sort of offset the camera, so your camera was always in the middle. But that's kind of like, that was Peter as any, so I'll save that for another one. Or you can always contact me afterwards and dig through the scene file. So once you have this, and let's just drop a camera in our scene. Just going to click here and zero out these values. So we're looking straight at it. If you select the bottom cloner and then do effector, shader effector, the cool thing about this rig is that if you put shader effectors on the bottom cloner, that it will affect all of the clones. So if you come into here, we're going to turn the scale off because we want it just to affect the color. And then inside of shading, if you switch from custom shader to, we'll do luminance because I'm going to set up the material on the luminance channel. So here, and if we double click down here and we have a new material, just untick color, untick reflectance, and tick luminance. And then in the texture, we're going to load that movie sequence that I showed first of all, which is the base. So this has been rendered out of After Effects, so you could feed anything into this. So, yeah, let's go back to here. And MoGraph. And we'll just chuck that in there. So this usually, if you're referencing an image sequence, you definitely want to click no here because we want it to reference like all of the frames in that image sequence. Here, I'm using a movie, so it's kind of self-contained. You can click yes or no, it's fine. But what we want to do is double click on this texture, actually just single click will do, and go into animation and make sure that if it's not calculating the whole image sequence, you want to click calculate, and if here it is because it's a movie, so it's fine. But if it was an image sequence, you want to click calculate. Then the next thing you want to do, because to make sure it shows up in our editor, is tick animate preview, and then in texture size, maybe you can increase it so that you can actually have some fidelity. And then I usually just drop this onto the shader, and then you can drop the texture tag in here. I'm just going to switch this to frontal mapping. And then because it's kind of like it's white where it should be black, I think this is because of use alpha strength. So here we go. And then the next thing you want to do, set up a MoGraph color shader. So I think, well, it actually renders right, but I'm pretty sure if we do this, it will update it in the viewport. So let's just call that color shader. And again, on the luminance channel, just so that the colors are exactly as we want them to be, just go luminance, texture, MoGraph, and then color shader. And we can drop that onto here, and then that way it updates. And so now you can sort of scrub through, and it's basically using that image sequence and kind of crushing it down. And also in your plane, you can kind of update and kind of displace it however you wish. And then go ahead from here. Let's get so you can see something. And say add like a shader effector that we want to scale like really crazy on the x-axis. And inside of shading, just make a noise. And so the noise is kind of like doing some weird stuff here. It's because it's set to texture mode. If we switch it to world mode, then it will affect all of your clones. So even though it's like only inside of this bottom shader, it affects all of the clones on a world level. So this looks kind of not very good, but that's the idea. So that by building up this, and you could sort of do this with any mesh. Like if you duplicated a load of triangles and maybe combine that with the new like honeycomb effector, you could sort of displace any image with any sort of kind of base mesh that you want to do. It's just basically taking the geometry and projecting a texture on it and then sort of pixelating it. So whatever shape your pixels are is the shape that it's going to be. Cool. So the next thing I wanted to show was a little thing that we did for Clarins in collaboration with an agency called Haygarth. And it's basically using like custom sources to drive the falloff of your effectors. So in this project, we had to kind of animate the stresses that your face went through from day through to night. Like Clarins is like a makeup brand, so they were doing this live experience where people would go into a booth, sit down, and have this facial projection sort of tracked onto their face in real time, and then they'd be able to sort of buy photographs of the experience and then also get sold the correct product for their skin type. So we had to kind of design and animate these scenes that range from like having dry skin that was caused by the sun, or being out in the cold, or being out in the rain, and have them feel quite organic and have them sort of mapped onto this person's face. So I'll really quickly show you the development reel. It's very like just chopped together, just showing some sort of behind the scenes sections. So yeah, that's a little behind the scenes look at the project. Just try, yeah. So the bit I wanted to kind of focus on was a little look into this sort of setup. Where basically what we have here is some sculpts of some ice, and we have some radial clones, and then we're cloning those radial clones along, and we're using a tracer to wipe them on and wipe them off. So I'll do it as one setup, but you can see here that like this is where the raindrops are falling down. I'm just pointing at my screen, you can't see that. So these were the raindrops for falling down, and this is basically driving the scale parameter of just a plane effector. This is kind of it more finished. Like, we had to push the colors a lot because when you project something, you want it not to be high contrast. You want it to be kind of like quite bright. So usually if this was final, we'd kind of crunch it down a bit more. But yeah, so what I'm basically going to show you is this idea of having your fall off driven by a custom source, and in this case, it's a tracer. So let's just jump into the scene file. So, sweet. Let's see if this plays through. Sweet. So what I have here is some like low-res kind of proxy geometry that's that's just there in place of the more high-definition sculpts. And with a simple bit of Espresso here, just made a switch so that we could switch out the low poly version for like so here we just have a bunch of cubes, and then you can tick this box. I won't do it because it might be really heavy, and it will just swap out the high-res sculpts for rendering. So you can have that set up for animation and then another one for render. And it's a similar process. So we have in here just a kind of radial cloner with a few effectors on it. Let's just tick this on so you can see. So yeah, so we have our kind of high-res sculpts with a little bit of animation, but I'll just switch that back to a basic one so that it runs a little bit smoother. And then these are set to radial mode with various effectors, and then we have those cloners dropped inside of another cloner that is essentially cloning it along this mesh, so that when we come to render it, it's all going to be mapped to the position of the face that we want. So if I go through and show you like the basic techniques to kind of use just Tracer as a fall-off source, and you can kind of throw anything into it and then have it drive these certain parameters. So let's just get a cube. And drop that into a grid array. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. And let's make this cube a little bit smaller, just so that it all... In fact, so 50, let's make this 10, 10, 10. Okay, so I'm just going to hide that for a second, because we don't need that until another minute. And then, so what we want to do is have something that's going to drive this tracer, and then that's going to then drive the fall-off. So we can just start with an emitter. Because our cloner is here, let's just drag this out to the side, hit play. And then what we want to do is, with our emitter selected, go MoGraph and then Tracer. And so now this is just basically going to draw a nice line for us. I'm just going to increase the frames down here, and then increase the speed so that the particles will move a little bit faster, and then just increase the stop emission so that, yeah. Sweet. So now we have this tracer that's going to basically fly through here and scale these cubes up, and then they'll scale back down. So let's turn inside of our tracer. We can limit it from the end, and if we just put a value of 10 in here, then it's basically going to draw a trail, but it's not going to last forever. And in fact, I want to make that 20, and then I want to stop the emission after 50, just so you can see it a little bit better. Sweet. Right, and then so if you're going to, you can have it drive any effector. In this case, I'm just going to have it drive a plane effector. And I'm going to set the scale to -1 to make them completely off. And then inside of our fall-off tab, down here, we can go to source. And so you can drag anything in, like into the source link. You could have just a sphere, or any kind of parameter could be just dropped into here. In this case, we're going to use the tracer because it's a good way of having animation right on and right off with one parameter. So let's just see if this is actually working. Yeah. So you can see here the tracer is going to come along, scale the cubes down. Let's just get rid of the grid a sec. And then they'll scale back on. But I'll just invert it, because then you can see what's actually happening a little bit better. And I'm going to move this along just so that it happens much quicker. So now it's scaling, the tracer is scaling these cubes on and scaling them off. And you can kind of go in here and increase the sample distance. So then basically it's going to look at the tracer and look at a radius around it and affect more cubes. And then the detail as well is going to just make it respond and behave a little bit better. And so once you have that, you could then drop that inside of a delay effector. And it looks a bit smoother. So now you have something that's driving the animation on and driving the animation off quite simply. And you can go a lot deeper with it, but that's just a basic kind of look into how something like this would be driven. So you have the tracer kind of running along here, animating all of these particles on, well, these sculpts on, and then as the rain comes down, that's more tracers, and it's just wiping everything off. So it's like, it's quite a simple setup, but you can kind of combine multiple things on there. So yeah, cool. The next thing I wanted to talk to you about as well was, it's part of the same project. I've called it Fake It Till You Make It. It's basically using like making a cloth simulation in Cinema 4D without using any cloth. So sometimes you might want to do that, sometimes you might not. So I'll just really quickly show you this edit. There was a part of the sequence that we did for Clarins where, so we had a front facial projection and then a rear projection behind them. And the rear projection was like big and they could see it in the mirror. And there's a part where they wanted the product to kind of clash together behind the head and have you see it sort of animate on their face. And they really liked this reference of like kind of iridescence and cloth, but also something that felt kind of like cream and fluid. But so rather than going into like fluid simulations or cloth sim, it was just like, well, let's just try it with like Jiggle Deformers and turbulence and things like that. So this is a real like, yeah, quick kind of idea of what was happening. And then this is sort of how the actual animation turned out. And so it's basically just using a plane, essentially, and layering up multiple deformers to create this real nice, like, organic, kind of wavy effect. And it was quite simply done. So yeah, let's just jump into this project file, and I'll break it down for you. So what we have here, let's just come out a little bit so you can see. Here we have our cloth that isn't cloth. And we're basically pulling it along. There's some turbulence going on in there. There's some jiggle, like a jiggle deformer is what's going to give it that kind of organic feel and that life. And there's some displacer. And then what we did is, once we had a render that we were happy with, just mirrored it so that it was just the same simulation happening on both sides to keep it nice and symmetrical. And I'll just go and sort of switch some things off so you can sort of see what's going on. So if I switch this one off first, and this is what we started out with. So basically, I'll show you this. This is just a plane that I rounded off just with a brush, like the paintbrush, set to smooth, because that way they didn't want any kind of hard corners on it. And then the next thing to do was just to add some displacement. So here's this, like, you can see it's quite sort of large scale displacement. That's just giving it a little bit of a bend. And then we have some smaller scale displacement. That it's just going to instantly sort of offset it. Then we have a Jiggle Deformer. So basically, inside of the Jiggle Deformer, we have turbulence set up. So I'll go through that a little bit quicker, well, more in detail in a second, but I just wanted to break down everything. I don't think we use the smoothing deformer at this stage. And then from that point, to give it some sort of secondary animation on top, we then switched this off, got the same geometry. Just going to switch off subdivision. And had used the surface deformer to inherit all of that animation. So the way that the surface deformer works is that if you have the same vertice count, you can map the animation or position, scale, and rotation parameters of another object onto a second object, and then animate further on top of it. So what we did was use the surface deformer. It's going crazy. I'll just go back to the camera view to basically reference this animation. So if I switch this off, it's just a plane. So it's getting everything like the position movement, it's getting the point deformation, just through that, and then adding a secondary jiggle again. I don't think with no forces, but it basically is just going to inherit like the inertia and give it some sort of secondary life. And then if you drop that inside of a hyperNURBS or subdivision surface, it's just going to sort of smooth out all of the geometry and get a much nicer deformation. So we have some time, so I'll talk through it quite quickly. So we have this plane. I'll keep it default. And what we want to do, first of all, is get a displacer. Let's go into noise. We can crank the heights up a little bit. Maybe crank the scale up. Crank the contrast. And the animation speed. So now we have this basic undulating animation. And just to show you how the surface deformer works, let's duplicate this plane. Let's get rid of the displacer. So call this plane inherit. Call this plane master. And so you can switch that off. You can see that there's no animation, there's nothing happening on this plane. But if you drop a surface deformer on it, sorry, let's go shift so it goes as a child. And then you can drop in this plane master into this surface parameter here and hit initialize. And then it's going to inherit the animation of this. So you could kind of basically deform your master, and then via the surface deformer, this is going to inherit it. And so on top of that, you can then add, where is it? Jiggle. Jiggle, 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 jiggle. There we go. Add a jiggle deformer. And then inside of the jiggle deformer, you can add some turbulence to give it even more animation. And then inside of here, adjust the scale and maybe adjust the strength. And so it becomes a lot more organic. You could, from this stage, you could either sort of smooth it out or drop it in a hyperNURBS. And those were the kind of basic techniques of layering up different deformers to create something that, you know, you end up having quite a lot of control over it. So we ended up with that, and there was no cloth used. The only sort of simulation used was turbulence, and you have a lot of control over that because you can change the scale and the speed. And so you can make something that's quite art directable with just using deformers and by layering up these animations. So you're basically taking something, adding animation to it, then using a surface deformer, adding more animation to it, and you could keep going and going and going. And then also you have like levels of control and iteration. You can go back and forth. Yeah, all you have to do is make sure that when you put in the surface deformer, you just hit initialize, and make sure that your vertice count. So in between your master object that's driving the animation and the one that's inheriting the object, they just have to have the same vert count, because otherwise it just will screw it up a bit. But if they have the same number of points, then the animation will match perfectly. And so you can even, like, if I just play this and see, I have the master highlighted, but it's affecting this one. It's affecting the inherited, even though I'm driving the position of the master, it's moving the position of this. So it's just all via the surface deformer. So yeah, that's that little trick. The last trick I wanted to show you, again, is another way of inheriting parameters, and it's using the inheritance effector for a screen that we did for Avengers: Age of Ultron. So we did a bunch of screens for a new character called Dr. Cho. She's like a crazy scientist, and I think she's one of the newer additions to the Marvel world at the time. Like this film's quite old now, but we had a lot of fun doing it. And there was a scene where Hawkeye had been shot and he was having his... Actually, no, this was to do with when the vision was being made in the casket. And so they wanted basically a background screen that showed like a body being basically made, almost like 3D printed, sort of fused together. And I'll show you the kind of full... This is like a little breakdown, just of showing the layers that were used and built up. Just with quite a simple setup of just like a few cloners and inheritance effector and some tracers, and then basically using the base geometry. So you can get this body inside of Cinema 4D's content browser. I think his name's Fred. But yeah, we didn't want to obviously have Fred showing up in a Marvel movie, so we had to do something that was a little bit different. So basically what we have going on here is like a cloner that is mapping a bunch of clones onto this geometry of the full body. And if I just hit up, you can probably see what's going on a little bit better. So actually, I'll just break it down for you. So basically, yeah, the premise is you clone clones onto the body, and then you have the same number of clones inside of a cloner that's totally zeroed out, and with Falloff you animate, and it just basically draws this line going upwards. So I'll show you that real quickly before I run out of time. So I'm just going to copy just Apple C, Apple N, Apple V, paste Fred into a new scene. And then what we want to do is get a cube. You could use anything. I usually use just like a 1-point spline to keep everything really efficient, but you won't be able to see it, so I'll use a cube here. It's with our cube selected. 10 minutes, sweet. Yeah, I'll just hold Alt and switch this to object mode. And then I'm just going to turn this off because by default, in object mode, it's going to clone onto every vertice of the object. And if your object's really heavy, then it's going to grind your machine down. But just by switching it off and then dropping in the object, it's going to bring up this menu here. And we want to switch it to surface because that way you can control the amount of clones that you have over this whole mesh. So let's just try 200. The reason why you want to know exactly how many clones are on here, because when we duplicate the cloner that's then going to inherit this position, we want it to, again, be the same number of clones. So let's call this cloner body. Bosey. Body. And then just duplicate that and call this cloner, like, inherit or whatever. Cool. And let's just switch that one off and switch that off. And so here we had 200. Let's switch this back to linear. Let's zero it out so that on the Y, and basically hit 200 here. So now we know we have 200 clones. Then what we want to do is add an inheritance effector. So I'm going to select this one and go in effector, inheritance. And then inside of the effector, you have this object, or this effector sort of attribute box down here. And we're just going to drag in this one. Basically, what that's telling this cloner to do is look at the position, scale, and rotation values of all of these clones. And we want to, I think, let's switch this one off. And so now it's kind of, by animating the strength, it's going to basically go from being zeroed out to being totally in position. And so what we had here was like this sort of linear movement from left to right, and you can do that with Falloff. So if you go inside of your inheritance effector and switch on Falloff and switch on linear Falloff, and then adjust the orientation. So let's try Y minus. And then we're just going to go and reduce the size. So now when we animate this up, you have this sort of just animation of it. But if you can see, the this cloner is sitting right at the bottom. We don't really want that. We kind of want this to go with the Falloff. So what we do is drop it inside of the inheritance effector, and if you zero it out, now when we animate, it's kind of pulling out from that same point. If I just go ahead and switch this off, and inside of here go MoGraph Tracer, then we should start to see what I'm talking about. So now we have this sort of tree being drawn. I'm just going to make this a little bit longer. In fact, I'll just animate it very quickly so you can see. So it's set a keyframe here. Make this a little bit longer. Go up to 200. Let's switch on Fred so we can see where his head is. Oh, perfect. And then set a keyframe here. And so now we have this tree that's going to draw out. And if you really wanted to, you could do a sort of thing where you have, let's do count expressions, set driver, and here do count expressions, set driven, absolute. And then you can have like a low poly version or like a low res version, and maybe you want a really high res version. And it's all linked together now. And then the second thing, because eventually it writes off, we'll do limit from end, just put like 20. And then you get this sort of animation of it writing on and writing off. Let's make that a bit longer, and let's even just go kind of crazy. And then the last thing inside of this one is just do like MoGraph Effector delay, and that's going to just basically make everything just a little bit more pleasing on the eye. And essentially that was like the idea, is just like render this out a few times, layer it up, and then you end up with something that looks like this. Just by adding on, obviously there's extra layers and extra render passes in there, but it's just that basic idea using inheritance. So yeah, that was that. So you get more of an idea of the kind of work that we do at Territory. This is our 2016 UI showreel. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. I've been Nick Hill of Territory Studio, and yeah, thanks for coming out.